Hello and good day. I'm Roy Dunbar and I'll be leading today's discussion on director compensation trends. Pearl Meyer and NACD recently published their 27th annual director compensation report, which examines evolving pay practices amid expanding oversight demands. In this discussion, we'll specifically look at emerging trends in equity design, committee compensation, and governance structures that are shaping compensation in 2026. With me today is the author of the report, Brian Urian, and his colleague, Tim Dupuy, experts in director compensation. I'm looking forward to a robust discussion, but before we start our program, Mary Canizales, who is with the NACD, has some housekeeping items to cover.
Thank you so much, Roy, and welcome everybody to the webinar. The Pearl Meyer team has put together a really informative presentation focused on their latest director compensation report with NACD, as Roy mentioned. This is its 27th year, and it marks kind of year-to-year trends that we're seeing focused on compensation, executive compensation. It's a topic that I'm sure drives a lot of questions within your boardrooms. And it may drive a lot of questions for these great folks. So please feel free to use the Q&A box to submit your questions by clicking on the Q&A button on the right of the screen. We built in a little bit of time for Q&A in the end, but there's a lot of information. So if you do submit your question with your name, we are going to give Pearl Meyer your contact information to make sure that they can answer that question in case we don't have enough time for it. This will also allow Pearl Meyer to share some thought leadership with you in the future. But I'm going to answer the number one question that everybody always gives me, and that is this presentation available? And yes, it's available in the resources page on this webinar and will be available in the post-webinar email as well. You can also see that our friends at Pearl Meyer will be sharing this as well on their website. This recording, as most of NACD recordings, is going to be available on our archive page early next week and will also be available on pearlmeyer.com. So on the next slide, I just want to remind folks that for those of you who are certified directors and fellows, your participation in today's live webinar earns you 1 credit towards maintaining that NACD credential. You will automatically receive that credit for your participation, so no need to do anything, although we do have polls and we hope that you will engage. Please note that you must attend the webinar for at least 50 minutes in order to receive that credit though. And speaking of our credentialing and certification program, if you're interested in setting yourself apart from other directors and just staying on top of current trends, we recommend you look into our certification program. This designation is a wonderful way to be able to set yourself apart from other directors and showing other folks through this designation that you are a person that is curious and always interested in learning. Reach out to your membership advisor at credentialing@nacdonline.org for more information. Finally, I want to remind folks that we will be asking you for your evaluation because we want to make these webinars as valuable to you as possible. So following the webinar and in our post webinar email, you will be getting a request for evaluation for this webinar, and we hope that you'll provide us some of your feedback. And with that, now for the crux of the information, Ryan, I'm going to pass it over to you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Mary. Myself and Tim are thrilled to be here. Certainly thrilled to be joined by Roy, as you know, he brings a lot of credibility to the conversation and kind of a real world lens into some of the trends that we'll be seeing and talking about. So certainly thrilled to have everybody here. I cannot believe it's been 25 plus years with Pearl Meyer producing this report. I think I've been leading it for the last 6 years, and that already seems like a blur. So in terms of what we're going to be discussing today, obviously the recently released NACD Director Compensation Report, which examines how board pay practices continue to evolve and expand amid expanding oversight demands. We're going to focus on emerging trends in equity design, committee compensation, governance structures that shape director compensation in 26. There will be several polling questions throughout that we're asking for participation in, and certainly we'll be leaning on Roy to get his real world expertise on some of these issues as well. In terms of our first polling question, so which of the following emerging priorities do you think have the greatest impact on board governance in the coming year? We've listed digital transformation, cybersecurity oversight, AI, workforce strategy, leadership development, regulatory compliance, and succession planning. Roy, while we give the participants an opportunity to respond to this question, I'd be interested to hear your experience on the boards that you currently sit. What are the emerging priorities that you're seeing that have the greatest impact on board governance in the upcoming years?
Well, I think you've got the top four there that I see, and your top one, which looks as if it's leading in the poll response. The whole area of AI, digital transformation, cybersecurity, both as it pertains to how the company is protected, how the company is using AI for leverage, and then how those tools can be used to reach out to customers safely.
Yeah, I'm not surprised by the polling results and the vast majority falling in category one. I am encouraged to see 13% in number four, because I do think succession planning is something that is starting to emerge, and some CEO succession failures that have been fairly magnified in the media and things of that nature. So I'm encouraged to see succession planning being close to the second, and certainly workforce strategy, return to office, those kind of things are certainly top of mind with a lot of the clients.
Yeah, Ryan, I agree. I think, if I think about, especially you and I have more experience in kind of the compensation committee meetings, B and D are probably a little more on top of mind than A, but, from a broader board perspective, hear a lot about A.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Next slide. So this is just, again, providing the group some tangibility around how the data in the NACD report is bifurcated. This is a similar methodology to the past reports. We essentially use 5 different size cuts, with the exception of the top 200, the large, medium, small, and micro all consist of 300 publicly traded firms reporting in each of those categories. So in totality, we're looking at data across 1,400 publicly traded companies, including 24 industry based on a GICS code group level. So it's a quite robust data set. We try to maintain companies in the same category year to year unless they move from a size perspective. So largely, if you were a micro company last year and you didn't exceed that $500 million threshold, you're generally still in that micro category in terms of the companies that we look at. So a fairly holistic view, definitely across industries, definitely across size. And as you'll see throughout this presentation and throughout the report, a lot of the data is delivered kind of, as I said, on these bifurcated size ranges to provide a bit more granularity to you and your company in terms of, what is apropos for us to adhere to based on our current size. First slide here is just looking at year-over-year growth in total compensation, total direct compensation for directors. In similar fashion to what we've seen over the last 10 or so years, low single digit across all firms. So a 3% year-over-year growth in total direct compensation for directors. Certainly more pronounced at the micro level, which it has been historically. The rationale behind that is in that micro category, you have a lot of companies that might be coming out of the emerging growth category and therefore are having to enhance their governance practices a bit. That generally leads to a little bit higher director pay in the interest of recruiting directors that are capable of those governance standards. I will say one interesting note on this. It's the first year since 2021 where there has been an increase across all size categories. I think that speaks to a little bit of the enhanced requirements at the board level, the amount of scrutiny, the amount of liability and some of the newer topics that are bubbling up that we previewed on that previous slide that might not have been on the board purview 5 or 6 years ago. So again, low single-digit increase year over year, certainly more pronounced in the micro and small categories for the reasons that I mentioned, but not much deviation historically in terms of overall firm increase year over year. This is looking at retirement age, director age, gender diversity. So there's quite a bit of information to digest on this chart. In terms of, median number of directors, not much change there. 9 is kind of the median number of directors across all firms. That's been consistent. The median director age did drop slightly year over year. I think we're going to see a continued trend in the median director age decrease, just given, and again, this speaks to kind of the first polling question where, the number one item that most participants responded to was cybersecurity, AI, technology. The feeling is that skill set might sit better with individuals that are not in that 60 to 65-year-old demographic, and therefore to bring some of that expertise on the board, we are seeing a drop in director age. So I anticipate that trend to continue in the out years and potentially even get to the low 60s or even in the high 50s. And Roy, I'd be interested when I get to the end of this slide to hear your thoughts on this as well. Mandatory retirement age, certainly something that is relatively static, but prevalent as you get larger in organization size in terms of at a certain age, and generally it's 75. There is a retirement from the mandatory retirement from the board. Something that's not represented on this chart, but I do think is getting traction and something that I want to provide the group is I do think you're going to start seeing a heavier reliance on term limits in addition to mandatory retirement age. And again, this speaks to the fact that I think the demographic on board service is going to get younger over time, given the additional skill sets that are required. And as a result of that, if you just have the mandatory retirement age and you start recruiting directors in their early 50s and your mandatory retirement age is 75, does that provide enough tangibility to director turnover, or is a term limit in addition to the retirement age something that is more apropos for companies that are looking to hire and retain younger directors? And we have certainly seen that play out in several of our clients. From a gender diversity perspective, obviously there's been some pushback from the current administration in terms of DEI. We haven't seen that really impact at this point in time the prevalence of female directors across. You saw a little bit of a decline in 3 or more female directors, but it's nominal. So those are the main takeaways here. I know it's a bit of a busy slide, but Roy, I just positioning to you, I mean, in terms of that concept around term limit, the idea around median director age potentially trending down, given some of the new skill sets that are bubbling up. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. So Ryan, I think the first thing is the cap on the upper age limit, which is exercised through 2 tools, either direct age limit or a term limit, and actually in a number of companies, both. So that is a direct catalyst to the fact that you have to be recruiting new, which means that you're going to get an average lower age. And then, of course, as you rightly referenced, the newer skills, some of which are not that new. Technology, is 20, 30 years old. That often has a younger demographic associated with it. And then many boards are now looking for people who have strong AI skills, but also have the broader credentials that would make them a good director, even without the AI skills. So those, I'm in full agreement with you. Those are what's driving this. And boards are still very interested in female directors, not for DEI purposes, but because of the fact that you're getting that representation of gender, which is, one of the biggest divisions in our society. and the tremendous wisdom that comes from having both genders around that decision table.
Absolutely, wholeheartedly agree on all the points, Roy. Thank you. Next slide. So this is our second polling question. In light of the evolving political and regulatory landscape, how do you anticipate your board's focus on ESG and DEI initiatives will change as it relates to director diversity? Increase focus and investment in ESG, DEI, maintain current focus and approach, decrease focus due to shifting external pressures, reassess priorities to align with emerging stakeholder expectations, or unsure. Roy, I'd be interested to hear your viewpoint on this. I'm seeing the early respondents come in. I think what I have seen is maintain, which is kind of the prevalent response, is maintain current focus and approach to all the points that Roy just alluded to on the previous slide in terms of the added benefit of diverse opinions on the board. I think everyone is understanding the value of that. The change that I have seen to some extent, Roy, and I again be interested to hear your thoughts on this, is while the internal approach hasn't changed and the internal focus is consistent, we might not be as vocal about it externally as we might have been historically, but still maintain those values internally because they're part of the culture. They're important for all of the reasons that we mentioned. Does that resonate with what you are seeing as well?
Ryan, it does resonate. I'd probably also add to that two other factors. The most important is that companies are increasingly international and global. And even though we hear a significant amount of dialogue in the US around DE&I, the European Union, Asia, and other regions are looking for standards that effectively impress upon international or global companies that doing business in their countries, in their regions, requires certain practices. And the other one, which is obvious, is that even in the US, companies who operate here have diverse customers. They may have predominantly Hispanic customers or customers of a different ethnicity or race, and they need to be able to look like and speak to their customers in a manner and language that those customers appreciate.
Absolutely agree. And I think the global concept that you brought to the table is absolutely true, and something that, you know, I encourage everyone to on this call to think about in terms of your organization and those kind of, you know, what that means on a global basis versus a US basis. But certainly agree. And I think Pearl Meyer's stance is, you know, as I said, the diversity of thought that comes from DEI and diversity within the boardroom has certainly added value and continues to add value.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that, Ryan, maybe as I think about from a executive compensation standpoint for those people that serve on compensation committees, I think we're certainly seeing less of ESG and DEI programs and incentive programs for incentives, but it is certainly talked about internally at all the committee meetings. But
yeah, I think from an incentive perspective, and again, this is some of that outward facing versus internal, because, you know, if I put ESG, DEI in my executive incentive program and I'm just publishing a proxy, then it becomes, you know, out there for public consumption. I have seen still some more reliance on ESG, more sustainability on ESG, no pun intended, versus DEI in terms of incentives, especially amongst companies that have a more significant environmental impact, that they still look at that ESG as important to shareholders, even though it might be less of a, you know, political issue at this point in time. So wholeheartedly agree with you, Tim. I think we've seen a little bit of scale back across both of those metrics in executive incentives, but more significantly on the DEI side than on the ESG side.
Yeah. Agree.
This is looking at cash retainer and equity retainers over the course of the year. It's in terms of increases or decreases, as well as meeting fees. As you can see across this, cash has remained relatively stable year to year. The only thing that we're seeing a decrease in is board meeting fees, and I'll talk a little bit about that. We've certainly seen an increase in equity awards, and I think, again, the prevalent thinking is, the more equity I provide my board members, the more aligned they are with shareholders, and the more they are aligned with long-term value creation of the organization. And that's what we want. Certainly, I think in terms of meeting fees, and this has been a phenomenon that we've talked about over the last several years in terms of the decreased reliance on meeting fees, is, I think there's just an approach to simplify board of director compensation. And I think, I have been in client meetings, board meetings, where there have been meeting fees, and you get on a 15-minute phone call and everybody looks at each other and goes, did that constitute a meeting? So, what happens with meeting fees is they can get lumpy year to year. So you can create some lumpiness in director compensation year to year, which, from an optics standpoint is not ideal. Now, I will say, I still think meeting fees potentially have a place in certain committees. If you have ad hoc committees that are not meant to be in perpetuity, that might be point in time committees, I have seen meeting fees work relatively well in those instances. But those are kind of the one-offs where we would generally recommend potentially, continuing some meeting fees. I think, and Tim's going to talk about this later, just in the idea of simplification, I think you're also seeing, in terms of, yes, the cash retainers are increasing somewhat, but I think the committee cash for members is starting to dissipate a bit and be more absorbed in that annual cash retainer. Again, just in the interest of simplifying director compensation and also allowing a little bit more mobility of directors across committees without it being at the detriment of compensation. So, and that's something we'll talk more in detail about later in the presentation when we look at incremental committee membership fees. But by and large, fairly modest increases across cash and equity with a decrease in reliance on meeting fees, and fairly consistent with what we've seen historically. In terms of the pay mix by level, again, fairly consistent. Equity generally makes up 55 to 60% of board compensation for all of the reasons that I alluded to earlier. I think the perception among shareholders is the more equity directors have, the more they're invested in the long-term success and long-term value creation of the organization. Certainly you see stock options. I mean, when I talk equity, it's generally full value restricted stock. That said, at the micro category, you still see some reliance, more heavy reliance on stock options. The rationale there is a lot of companies in that micro category have a stock price that is not conducive to full value share grants, meaning they might be trading at 50 cents to $1, and to try to provide competitive value on a full value basis would require such a dilutive impact in terms of share spend that a lot of those companies will opt to use stock options under the interest that if the stock price can increase over time, they can become, competitive from a value perspective. But I think the feeling broadly on stock options is they just inherently create a little bit more risk at the director level than full value shares. And that's why you see full value stock being the predominant approach in terms of long-term incentive value. Certainly cash still plays a significant role, but again, the lion's share of the compensation we're seeing delivered in equity, which is consistent with how we've seen it in the past, slightly ticking up over the last couple of years. Another polling question, and again, Roy, be interested to hear your feedback on this, but how has your board's pay mix evolved over time? We've moved away from variable pay elements, meeting fees, committee fees, toward fixed elements, cash and equity retainers. We've moved away from fixed pay element, cash and equity retainers toward variable pay elements, meeting fees and committee fees. I'm not expecting any to go in bucket two. And then the pay mix has largely remained the same over time. So early response are showing, 3, Roy, which doesn't surprise me. You generally don't see that much year-over-year change in director comp, but certainly 1 has about a third of the respondents reporting into one. And that's where I have largely seen the changes occur amongst my client base, is really in that, moving away from meeting fees, committee fees, toward more fixed pay elements, equity, cash retainers. And as I alluded to earlier, I think the rationale behind that is director mobility is becoming increasingly important. Meaning, if I move somebody from audit to nominating and governance, and I don't have incremental committee fees for those committees, and it's largely being delivered through the cash and the equity retainers, it's not at the detriment of the compensation for that director. So it allows just a little bit more seamless mobility of moving directors around committees without it being perceived as a compensation haircut. But Roy, any thoughts on that and what you're seeing?
I have very little to add because, Ryan, your comments, I think, capture everything that I'm seeing. The responses here and the answers, we have, relatively minor amounts of variable pay in the survey data that you have. And so answer C, the pay mix has largely remained the same, is more or less the experience that I'm seeing, and I think most of my other colleagues.
Yeah,
I agree. I would have expected to see CNA being the predominant choice here. Especially A, and I'm not sure the directors that have responded and what companies they serve on, but I would guess that those are more smaller, medium companies.
Or companies that are just meeting a tremendous amount, Tim. I mean, I'd be interested to see who responded to on this, because as I said, I think the impetus, either to your point, is smaller organizations or companies that are just, the number of meetings per year fluctuates so significantly that you potentially bake in some of this, variable pay to accommodate the time sink in certain years. But I agree with you. I was expecting 1 and 3 to be the predominant responses here.
All right, we'll go to the next slide. And here we're looking at the percentage of total director compensation that is delivered in the form of equity, and specifically those companies that are delivering more than half of the compensation in equity. For those of you that have been on top of our reports for the past several years, we've kind of called this out as a best practice. If we look back 7-10 years ago, we would have seen these micro and small companies, the prevalency being below 50%. But we're at a point now that, more than 80% of all, or more than 85% of all companies are delivering more than 50% of total compensation to directors in the form of equity. And it goes back to Ryan's point earlier that, it's more aligning the directors' compensation with shareholders. So nothing mind-blowing here. You can see an increase year over year, really across all size firms. We saw a little dip in the medium-sized companies. I suspect that's an anomaly, and we'll see that change next year.
Yeah.
Moving to how the equity is granted. Obviously, the vast majority of companies within our report do grant equity to their directors. It does tend to increase with the size of the company. We see 99% of the top 200 companies delivering equity to their executives. The majority of the companies continue to deliver equity in the terms of a fixed value, saying that we're going to provide $100,000 in equity to our directors on a year-over-year basis, and the number of shares that they get granted will be based on the stock price, on the date of the board meeting. within micro companies, we do see, it's only 12%, but we do see companies delivering a fixed value or a fixed number of shares rather than a fixed value. But that goes back to Ryan's point earlier. These are more likely companies that have a really low stock price, and they're trying to deliver growth to directors that is in line with the shareholders.
Yeah, and again, I think this just speaks to a desire to have consistency in year-over-year director compensation, right? If I'm providing it on a fixed share basis, the value is going to bounce based on where my stock price is trading at that point in time. Whereas when I do a fixed value approach, regardless of where I'm using the stock price to back in to the number of shares. So there's a more significant consistency in year-over-year compensation on a fixed value versus a fixed share approach. And to Tim's point, fixed share generally at that micro level, when the stock price is significantly low, and makes it difficult, as I say, on a fixed value basis to provide competitive value without, depleting the share reserve to some extent.
Yep. Roy, any comments there?
Yes, just one which recognizes that we are here focused on companies that are domiciled in the US, and we're doing this view of equity from that perspective. Very large international companies that are, say, headquartered in Europe, they actually have no equity as part of direct compensation. And I found that an increasing number of my fellow directors are actually serving on boards that are domiciled in Europe. So this is very much a US-centric view. There's a slightly wider lens that some of the audience members here may experience.
That's fair. Thanks, Roy. Here we're looking at the top part of these two tables. We're focusing on the prevalence of stock ownership guidelines. So we are seeing, a really minor increase in companies that require their directors to hold a certain amount of equity. More often than not, it is defined as a multiple of the annual cash retainer. Typically, we can see on one of these rows here, 5 times the annual cash retainer is the most prevalent approach really across all size companies. We see it a little smaller in the micro companies at 4 times. And then the bottom row in the top chart, the time frame that companies typically require directors to establish those guidelines is 5 years across the board. A little more interesting, if we look at the bottom table, is we are seeing a change in how companies are allowing their directors to hold their shares. We're seeing an uptick in companies that won't allow their directors to sell shares until those ownership guidelines are met. So you can see, especially in the micro companies, we saw a pretty big change in companies that were allowing directors to not sell their shares until retirement, and they've changed to until that ownership guideline is met. You can see that the percentage of companies that require these holding requirements increases by company size. So less prevalent in micro companies, a lot more prevalent in the larger companies.
Yeah, I think some of the nuance on this holding power, and Roy, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts here. I think you're seeing that change in micro where you've seen a drop in hold till retirement and an increase in hold until ownership guideline is satisfied, given some of the volatility that's been in the market. So, if you force somebody to wait until retirement and the stock is, drops significantly, even after they've satisfied the ownership requirement, you could probably disappoint some of the directors potentially. That said, as you move up the spectrum, and Tim alluded to this, the propensity of hold till retirement is strong, especially if you look at the top 200. And I have seen more clients starting to lean into this holding guideline under the pretense that it helps facilitate board refreshment. Yeah. Because if I'm requiring a director to leave the board or retire from the board in order to tangibly cash in their equity awards, it's potentially an impetus to maybe have somebody leave the board earlier than they might have to get that value. So if you look at the top 200 on some of these things, I think I'm seeing a little bit more of that, Roy, as this concept of board refreshment and things become more prominent in the marketplace, that maybe baking in a hold till retirement is a good conduit to help not necessarily facilitate board refreshment, but continue to kind of push board refreshment forward to some extent. Any thoughts on that?
Ryan, I agree with the findings that you have there, so I wouldn't have anything to further.
Okay.
Okay, next slide, we're going to look at committee chair compensation. This has been something that we've seen over the last several years. The additional compensation that is paid to the chairs of the audit committee still leads the market relative to the other 3 standing committees, and that's a reflection of the amount of time that is likely spent in the audit committee versus some of the other committees. The one comment I would make here, and Ryan and Roy, if you have any other comments, we are seeing a narrowing of the gap between the pay and compensation committee chairs and nominating governance committee chairs, because we're seeing kind of more time and roles and responsibilities dedicated to those nom-gov chairs.
Yes, I agree with that. I also wonder whether we may see a narrowing gap between the comp chair and the audit committee chair, because as the two of you know, compensation is it is sometimes very heavy and very complex. One of the things that we've seen is shorter average CEO tenure, therefore more CEO turnover. When the CEOs turn over, often you get changes in the C-suite. So this committee, I think, has a heavier and more complex workload this day.
100%. And I agree with you, Roy. I think, there's still this dichotomy with audit, just given the skill set that's required somewhat at the audit chair level. Yeah. So I think you'll still see, but I certainly could see a narrowing of the difference between audit and comp. Speaking to Tim's point earlier on comp versus nom-gov, that dichotomy squeezing over time, certainly something we've seen. And I think this speaks back to, one of the first polling questions, the AI topic. Tim, you mentioned this. Maybe I'm not hearing it at all my comp committees. Maybe that's sitting more in nom-gov. So I think there, succession planning, does that sit in comp? Does that sit in nom-gov? I think there's dichotomy around where those sit amongst organizations. And as a result, you're seeing that line being blurred a bit. Whereas 5-6 years ago, I think what you're looking at in the micro category was really consistent across most of these categories, was kind of almost a 5,000 to 10,000 differential across the chairs for each of these committees. Certainly, we've seen that dissipate somewhat for comp and comp and nom and gov difference. But to Roy's point, I think you're going to see probably some of that same phenomena happening between audit and comp going forward, given some of the additional responsibilities of the comp committee.
Yeah. So the next slide, if we if we move there, focuses on additional compensation that may be paid to members of different committees. And we're seeing a trend here where companies are moving away from paying additional compensation for directors that serve on committees, and they're rolling that up into the annual board cash retainer. And that leads to Ryan's point earlier, where there's a lot of fluidity within the directors moving from committee to committee. You can see, among the top 200 companies, the median value of additional compensation for committee members is 0. So most of the top 200 companies are not providing additional compensation for serving on a committee. I suspect over the next couple of years, based on the prevalency data we're seeing, we're going to see a typical thing with the large and medium companies as well. Is I believe the prevalence of that additional committee member compensation is hovering right above 50%. But similar to the committee chairs, those companies that do provide additional compensation to committee members, the audit committee members tend to get more compensation than the other 3 standing committees.
Yeah, I think this just speaks, I think this further reinforces the point on comp and nom-gov coalescing around kind of a similar pay, incremental pay range. I think, as you look to the top 200, this chart's showing median. So the top 200 suggests less than 50% of those companies are providing incremental committee member compensation. Again, I think you're going to start seeing that bleeding into the large, medium. I still think you'll probably see micro and small provide some of it, but I think over time, again, under the interest of director mobility, you're going to start seeing more of these committee member fees baked into the annual cash and equity retainer rather than provided on an incremental basis for committee service. Just because, as I said, it becomes an easier conversation, an easier exercise to move somebody off of a higher paying committee to a lower paying committee if there's not pay associated with that committee, so to speak. So yeah, something that, and Roy, is this something you've seen in terms of any of the companies that you're working with in terms of, a movement away from incremental committee member? I still think incremental committee chair fees are here to stay, so I don't think those are going away, but we have seen from a member perspective a scale back in recent years.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, maybe Roy, sorry not to interrupt, but one of the trends I'm seeing in several of my clients is committee or board members are attending all committee meetings more often now and being more involved. And so I think that's another reason why we're seeing this trend.
Yes, I do agree with this. And I just add the place where I would see a differentiation in committee compensation. And I know here we're looking at audit, but there may be committees that meet for an additional day over and above the rest of the committees and the board. So in those, rare but not insignificant occasions, you may get different compensation.
Yeah. And I've seen sometimes too, as I alluded to earlier, Roy, in those instances where those aren't determined to be in perpetuity type of committees, maybe it's done more on a meeting fee type of basis to acknowledge that. But I agree with you, and I think that is a very good call out. If you have committees that are outside of the 3 major committees that are either meeting significantly more than your regular committees, or the time commitment is significantly higher, you could potentially see a difference there in terms, or additional compensation provided there, either through a full committee stipend or something more in the ilk of a meeting fee.
Yes, and that certainly is a practice, but the point I should have been a little clearer on is that there may be a standing committee of the board that literally has, a regular cadence, 4 or 5 meetings a year, that is one incremental day, that usually before the full board starts.
Yeah, agreed. And that would generally require a premium over, what you're seeing here. Yes.
And Roy, that kind of leads into our last polling question based on your comments. If we think about the expanding responsibilities and oversight of the board, we think about artificial intelligence, cybersecurity, ESG. How are the participants, boards, kind of reacting to that? Are you establishing new committees to address these areas? Are you in the process of thinking about establishing these new committees? Are the existing committees effectively overseeing all the areas, or are existing committees structured effectively overseeing all areas without the need for changes? My experience, and Ryan and Roy would be interested in your thoughts as well. I feel like I'm not seeing a lot of my clients establishing new committees, but rather adding more roles and responsibilities to other committees, which I think leads to some of the trends in compensation, moving away from committee fees and increasing, just the larger board fees in general.
Yeah. So perhaps a couple of comments here between A and B, which talked about either establishing a new committee or thinking about it. One perspective is that of the investors. Investors are increasingly asking about technology committees, and within them, the expertise of directors with AI. And so there's a really interesting dialogue around that. So does a company establish a technology committee that looks at IT, cybersecurity, AI, or are those topics full board topics which bring in external experts and in the same vein are actually educating directors who may not be natively digital through the course of a full board dialogue? That to me is a very interesting question, and it's been teased at by investors who really are looking to understand how the company is using digital, how the company is thinking of using AI, and whether it judges that there is a significant catalyst that could have that company leap forward through using technology better than its peer group.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Roy, in terms of, are these additional responsibilities better suited in a full board environment, or are they better suited in a separate committee environment? I'm not surprised to see 3 being the predominant response amongst the participants. I can't tell you how many committee charters I've looked at over the last 2 to 3 years with the idea that says, look, we have to expand, we have to adjust the committee charters and things of that nature to align with the expanding scope. So I get that, but the fact that we see roughly 35% of the participants either evaluating the need for a new committee or recently establishing a new committee certainly points us to the fact that, there is some momentum in this space. But I think Roy brings up a tremendous question, which is, are those topics better in a side committee, or are they better for discussion at the full board level? And I think that is something that, I encourage all participants on the call today to think about as you're, looking into new committees.
Okay, so Ryan, those are good points, but I know we don't have very many other slides, but let's see if we can move through those at a reasonable pace so that we can get to Q&A.
Yeah, I can go through these next slides pretty quickly. Here we're looking at leadership or board leadership compensation. specifically relative to typical director compensation. Those boards that have a non-executive chair where the CEO isn't the chair of the board tend to pay higher compensation levels than those that have a lead or presiding director. And it's pretty, the multiples for the non-executive chairs tend to increase with company size. Whereas if you have a lead director where the CEO is the chair and someone's the lead director of the board, we don't see, a huge change in multiple there. And, we have seen non-executive chair compensation increase over the past several years, just due to the expanding responsibilities of the board. But, those multiples are pretty common.
Yeah. I think some people consider the non-executive chair role being equivalent to a whole new, other board. So it carries that level of time commitment.
Yeah.
Yep. And then our last slide before Q&A, just kind of key takeaways. We're seeing kind of a streamlining approach to director compensation. The reduction of meeting fees and committee member compensation, more of a shift to equity versus cash, and then kind of these bottom bullets here: emphasis on board refreshment, a need for specialized committees given some of the additional responsibilities, especially in that technology area. But I don't know if Roy or Ryan have any additional.
I think you've covered it. Let's in Roy's comment, let's get to the Q&A because we're close to the end here, and I want to make sure we can answer a few questions.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thank you so much, Ryan and Tim, and I'll be directing some of the questions at you. In fact, we have the first one, which is, can you expand on the topic of term limits? What are you seeing on average? Is it 10, 12, or some other year limit?
Great question. I would say, 10 is probably the most common that I see in my experience. I've certainly seen 12. I think those are in the ballpark. I think ISS Glass Lewis had a comment historically that once you've served on a board for more than 9 or 10 years, are you really considered independent at that point in time? So 10 years I think is kind of the most prevalent approach that I have seen from a term limit perspective.
Very good. And Tim?
Yeah, no, I agree with Ryan. That's my experiences as well with what I've seen. I do think the term limits are going to become more prevalent over the next few years.
Yes, and I think it's also, to a certain extent, consistent with the philosophy of the NACD that refreshment is good for a board,
yes,
good for a company.
Yep, exactly right. Fresh ideas, 100%.
So we'll take the next question if we have one. Will we start seeing performance metrics for board members? A lot of board members may no longer bring value, apropos to our earlier point, as in the past. So should companies be looking at it differently than in prior years?
This is a fantastic question and something that I get quite a bit. I think there's this risk consideration when you layer performance on top of board members to some extent. Now, I think if that performance is very carefully crafted and it's somehow strictly apropos to board service and not necessarily how the company is performing to some extent, I think you could potentially see that. Now, I think one of the things that we have, and this is expanding on this question a bit, is one thing that I have thought about is given the need in some of these newer areas, AI, cybersecurity, where there's a more finite talent pool. And to Roy's point, not only finding someone that's well-versed in those areas, but finding someone that's well-versed in those areas that can still function as a high-performing director is a whole other skill set. And I think as companies continue to face pressure on that end and finite talent, is there an impetus in a historically very coalesced around a median type of compensation approach, meaning I don't have a lot of clients that say we want to lead or lag the market on director comp? Are you going to see some companies that go outside of the norm on director compensation in some form or fashion to help recruit and retain some of those directors that have more of a finite skill set? We have not seen it play out as you look across the year-over-year changes in this, but I do think that is something to keep in mind. Are you going to start to see companies differentiating a bit more on board compensation in the interest of trying to recruit and retain directors that have a bit more of a finite talent set?
Yeah, I agree with Ryan. I don't think we're in the near future going to see kind of incentive plans for boards. I think indirectly moving more towards equity-based compensation for boards, brings that performance in and aligns with shareholders. But yeah, I don't see necessarily performance metrics anytime soon.
Well, just rereading the question, there's another take on how it may be interpreted, and I'll perhaps give two good practices. The take may be, well, how do you get rid of a director who's not up to scratch?
Yeah.
So I've seen two things that work well on boards. Some boards actually do have performance management type of appraisals, annual appraisals for each director. Other boards have an effective chair or lead independent director who observes, collects feedback, and has discrete conversations. And if a board member isn't stepping up following those, then they may be asked not to stand for the next election. Those are two very good practices. It doesn't need to be formal. It could be just a very effective lead independent director or chairman or even a committee chair. And I've seen that work extremely well.
Yeah, I think that, and I see Mary, so I know we have to stop, but Roy, great points. I think, a board evaluation process, whether formal or informal on an annual basis, is something that we definitely recommend at Pearl Meyer to help kind of facilitate the discussions around performance without it being tied intrinsically to compensation. So I think there are avenues, to Roy's point, to call out underperformers or get underperformers off the board without it being a compensation driven discussion. So
yeah, and I agree, and I've seen an uptick of that in some of the boards I work with, where they're doing directors are doing 360 feedbacks on each other.
Exactly. Well, look, Tim and Ryan, thank you so very much for this. We're going to move over now to the close, and Mary will take us through that. Mary, may I turn to you?
Thank you, Roy, for joining us and providing your board experience. I know that our directors love to hear from other directors, so thank you for joining us and for peppering in with the expertise that Ryan and Tim have provided. And while we ran out of time, I just want to remind you all that if you put in a Q&A and you did give your name, that we will share those questions with the team here so that they can follow up with you via email. But another reminder that if you would like the slides, these are available in the resources and will also be available in your post-webinar email that is coming to you. So just one or two quick reminders. One, please remember to fill out the evaluation that we have in the Attendee Hub or in the link that follows in the email. Again, we really value your feedback, and it helps us improve not only this webinar series, but all of our webinars. And speaking of this webinar series, mark your calendars and keep an eye on our webinars page for registration. Our next compensation series webinar is on April 21st. If you want to find out about previous webinars in this series, you can always go to our archive at nacdonline.org/webinars and on Pearl Meyer's Insights and Research page. With that, this concludes the program today. Thank you so much for joining us. Have a wonderful afternoon wherever you are, and we'll see you on April 21st.